Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Ciaran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast. Today we are joined by my good old friend there, Ciaran O'Regan. And if you're watching on video, you will see that wild woolly head on him. He is turned into some sort of mammoth. In actual fact, given the fact that our guests today are in the Pacific Northwest, you may have found the first evidence of the Sasquatch here. He might be hiding out. He might be hiding out in Ireland. So yeah, there he is. Ciaran, it's about, was it midnight for you, is it?
Yeah, midnight.
So
12.
It's midnight for Ciaran. It's just gone 7 a.m. for myself. And for our guests today who join us from the Ernest Becker Foundation, we have Lyla and Deborah who join us from Arizona for Lyla and Seattle for Deborah this morning. So multiple time zones here, multiple states of alertness. So this will be interesting. So in this series, we have been breaking down the book, The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. And as you'll know by now, Ciaran is a scholar in this area. He has been driving me crazy for years to read Becker's book. I've just received The Worm at the Core, which is derived from this theory. And I've been watching and listening to some of Sheldon's work as well recently. So we're going to kick this podcast off with maybe if we could just get a little introduction, Lyla, from yourself first, and then from you, Deborah, on your role with the Ernest Becker Foundation as way of context.
Sure, thanks. Hi, I'm Lila Rothschild, and I'm the program director at EBF. I came to EBF by way of terror management theory research, which is the field of psychology that is derived from Becker's writings, among other existential writers, but most dominantly Ernest Becker. And I was doing some research in that field of terror management theory prior to coming to work for EBF. So that's predominantly my background there.
Excellent. Thanks, Lyla. And Deborah?
Hey there, my name is Deborah Jacobs, and I am the executive director of the EBF. I am a volunteer, and I've been involved for, 10, 15, maybe 20 years. I learned about Ernest Becker when I was taught as a freshman at Skidmore College by Sheldon Solomon in the mid-'80s, when he was just beginning to develop terror management theory and do testing on it. So in my professional life, I'm a human rights and civil liberties advocate. I worked for over 20 years for the ACLU, and most recently I've been doing a lot of police accountability work.
It's very interesting at the moment, given our current climate, that we see. So that's very interesting. Thank you very much. I suppose just before we kick off with some questions, just for overview, how would you, for those people who are just listening to this episode in isolation, how would you describe or how would you characterize who Ernest Becker is? Like a slight little biography, maybe for want of a better word, of who Ernest Becker is, and then probably how that links into terror management theory, because we will be having a lot of conversation around this today. Just a kind of a quick timeline. That'd be good.
I'll give it a shot, and then I'll invite Lyla to chime in with important things I missed. Ernest Becker is a cultural anthropologist who wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, in the early 70s. He was a really interesting person who unfortunately died himself prematurely. He died of colon cancer at age 49 with 3 young kids. And he posited theories that the uniquely human awareness of our mortality has a profound impact on our behavior, and we have to have ways of coping with that. And he talks a lot about the role of culture in terms of it giving us societal markers for success and failure. I think when I think about the anxiety affiliated with the awareness of our mortality, I think about anxiety being like there all the time, just under the surface, versus fear, which is an immediate threat type of reaction. Because fear of death in Becker's world isn't really fear of dying, it's fear of life without meaning. And if we can create meaning in our lives, then we're better able to cope with that pervasive anxiety. And now I'll throw it to Lyla to talk about where it went from there, or fill in the blanks that I might have left.
Thanks, Deborah.
Yeah, so Becker was a really interdisciplinary scholar, and so he taught at various institutions and often had trouble with that, actually, in terms of them not liking that he wouldn't just fit into one box. But that's sort of his whole problem with academia. And so he would always often, I mean, you might get a little sense of that from even just some of his books, The Denial of Death.
Maybe Lyla, that's why me and Ciaran like him.
Probably why a lot of people like him. Yeah. So yeah, he started out doing like undergrad and grad at Syracuse, and then in New York, and then taught there a little bit. And then he was at Berkeley for a little while, UC Berkeley, and he was a huge hit there, but again, got ousted, and the students fought really hard for him. So it was more of an administration problem. If you go on our site, I think either under About Becker or something like that, we have a photo of some students petitioning to keep Becker at Berkeley. And then he went a little briefly to San Francisco State University and finally ended at Simon Fraser in Vancouver, which is where he died as well. So The Denial of Death was published in 1973. And it wasn't until the mid 80s that terror management theory was founded. And that was by 3 social psychologists, and Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pazinski. They founded terror management theory, same authors of The Worm at the Core, the book you mentioned earlier. Basically, they were in grad school, and I think it was Sheldon who stumbled upon Becker, one of the books. It might have been The Birth and Death of Meaning or Denial of Death, and just completely had already been looking into things like self-esteem, why people need self-esteem, sources of values, worldview, things like that, and especially like prejudice and intergroup hostility. They'd already been like fascinated with all of that and doing some research. And so Becker, and then stumbling into Becker, just they felt it really put all the pieces together of like that missing piece of like, wow, it's death anxiety really is the underlying theme of all of these constructs, and it just fit with the work they were already doing. And so they decided to try to create a theory that might empirically test Becker's ideas, because up until that point he was a professor, but he had never done his own like research studies in the lab and things like that. So they came up with terror management theory, originally just as a theory to propose, and it was pretty much immediately rejected by the scientific community. And so then they said, well, let's go prove it. And they started doing these experiments where they would remind people of mortality versus control subjects who weren't, and observe differences in behavior mostly related to self-esteem striving and worldview defense. So that's how that all ties together. If we answered your question, let us know.
No, that's great. That's a great overview. I quite like the fact that people demonstrated for him, and the students, and even offered to pay salary. That resonated with me straight away. I like that. So he must be pretty good, because most students want to just tear down the establishment. So he must have been quite good. So and I think that's really nice. And before I hand it over to Ciaran, I think on the point there, what you said about not putting into a box, that's one of the reasons why myself and Ciaran get on so well, is because we cross these multidimensional areas where like we do scientific research, and Ciaran's been working on his professional doctorate. I'm working with the unis as well, doing adjunct work, and have a consulting business with industry. I have a consulting business with athletes. I like doing this kind of philosophy stuff as well. I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu martial arts. I do long distance swimming up to 20K. So I'm full of tattoos. I like Eastern philosophy. I'm Irish, raised a Catholic. So people are like, which box do you put you into? And it's like, well, you can chop me up and put me into all the boxes because I'm a little bit of everything. And I think I like crossing multiple domains. So that definitely resonates with me personally. So that's really nice. Now, I know Ciaran is jumping at sorry, Deborah.
May I jump in just
yes,
to follow up
please.
on what you said? In addition to creating content and information that relates to Ernest Becker's work, one of the things that it's sort of a collateral benefit of what we do is people who read Becker get really excited about it and come to us, and they want information and they want connectivity. And I think that Ciaran's experience being, drawn to it is like many people who read Becker. For myself, when I was taught The Birth and Death of Meaning as a freshman at Skidmore, like it suddenly just like put all these pieces of life into a framework that made sense to me and fit in with my observations of the world and that kind of thing. Over time, it's proven to be, and terror management in particular has proven to be tremendously personally beneficial, because understanding the way we respond to certain things, and I have a strong personality, I react strongly in all directions, and it's really allowed me the mindfulness to step back and be like, why, Deborah? Why do you immediately dislike this person when you meet them? What are they threatening in your world, in your viewpoint, that makes you feel the need to kind of tighten up about it? And it's a very powerful tool in life, whether you learn it through death denial work or you learn it through another form of mindfulness. The information and the lens of it has been tremendously beneficial personally, as well as in my advocacy for human rights as well. So a lot of people, as you described yourself, Ian, I think like fit into that, a little bit like contrarian, truth-seeking kind of personality that grasps onto Becker. And the one last thing I'll say that I love about Becker's work, and Lyla and I were just talking about earlier today, is Becker is for the religious or the non-religious. It can fit with lots of political ideologies. It can, for better and worse, it can be applied and thought of in many different contexts of life. So I do think it has really something for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's really nice. I'm going to hand over to my co-host now, because if you can imagine a 5-year-old child on Christmas Eve, this is what Ciaran is like today. Ciaran, I know you've got a slew of questions. Please proceed, because I'm really fascinated by this.
It's just like that. It's like trying to figure out where to start, like trying to eat an elephant. Where do you begin, like, The
trunk. I keep telling you this. Get to the trunk. Start with the trunk.
Yeah. So you mentioned there, I suppose a good way to start is just based on what you had said there, Deborah, where you mentioned that Becker is for the religious and non-religious alike. And in The Denial of Death, it seems that in particular, he has this kind of contrast between Freud as the non-theistic approach to trying to navigate life and the awareness of death and the meaning problem. And then he contrasts that with Kierkegaard as the religious leap of faith. And there's those two strands that he addresses, and he goes back and forth, and he comes at it from the perspective of almost this concept of the twin ontological motive and these two different directions that you could go. I don't know if I'm kind of mixing up two questions. Before I go on to that, I suppose, given that you're way more years and decades familiar with this research and Becker himself, would you have any insights or any thoughts on why he would have chosen Freud as and maybe it's because I'm lacking some historical context around, let's say, 1973 when the book was published. Freud may very well still have had much more of a relevance in culture and the zeitgeist and in clinical practice, even in the kind of psychology world. So maybe that's why. But why Freud over someone like Kierkegaard or over someone like Nietzsche or Camus or Heidegger, who also were existential thinkers? from a non-theistic sense, first of all, and then I suppose I'll start with that. Why Freud in particular? Because there was so much emphasis on him, and that's open to the both of you. I just was really curious about that.
Well, first of all, your question is above my pay grade. Hopefully Lila will be able to dig in deeper, but I will share a couple reflections with you. One is that one of the things people love about Becker, and it sounds like you do too, is he grabs from so many philosophers, psychiatrists, and anthropologists, and he just takes them and moves them around. And it's just like an education in itself to get the exposure he gives you to those kind of thinking. And as I mentioned earlier, he died a very young man, 49 years old. So I'm not even sure he, got where he would ultimately get. But when I talked about him sort of being for the religious or the non-religious, I guess what I meant to say is that Becker believed that we need coping mechanisms to deal with the day-to-day anxiety of mortality awareness. And if religion is one that calls to you and speaks to you and you can believe in, then that is a wonderful and great thing and should be embraced. So for me, I'm an atheist, or a J-theist, as I call myself, because I have a little bit of Jewish culture I can't get rid of. And yet it still speaks to me because I look at the coping mechanisms I use and the belief systems that I assert in order to do it. So for me, it's a little bit of a no judgment zone, with Becker, which I appreciate in that. As for why he relied in one thinking area more than another there, I'm going to see if Lyla has something super smart to say, but I exhausted my intelligence on that one.
I would say that one of the reasons, well, I guess, I don't know if I totally understand your question, but I feel like so he does draw on like those other existential writers that you mentioned, Nietzsche and Camus and Sartre and stuff like that. But he really did like narrow and like focus in on Freud and keep going back as like a reference point through much of the denial of death. Part of that might be because Freud was a lot more in the, as you said, just in the dominant psychology culture at that time. And even though I think Freud's word wasn't necessarily like God at that point as much as it was in like Freud's heyday, but I still think that people thought so much of what people knew about and associated with psychology was through Freud. So I think, well, people have also said that basically Becker is to death as Freud is to sex. And Becker's main point was like, Freud was really, really onto a lot and had a lot of insightful, important things to say about the human psyche and like the subconscious, but that he just got the topic wrong. Like, it's not the sex thing that really bothers us, it's the death thing. And on top of that, sex actually reminds us of death. So it's still in there. Like, it's one of the things, but not for the reason that Freud was focusing on. And I think he just I think it was an easy person to keep going back to compare, like, this is why my theory is different than this other main dominant theory. Because if you think about it, they are really similar. And like, they are both talking about those unconscious impulses and like the defenses and the ego and the id and all this stuff. But he's like, I just want to be clear that this is where I think Freud got it wrong, and this is what I'm trying to do. And I think that's why he, And then in terms of the religion, I think your other question is a little bit separate. So the twin ontological motives are actually about, one is the motivation to stick out and be like unique and special, and then the other one is to like blend in and like fit in and be part of the group. Those are the twin motives. And so like too much of one gives us too much existential anxiety because too much sticking out and we don't feel like securely embedded, but too much blending in and we feel not special either because we're just one of many. So that's and what Becker was saying in the context of that and religion is that I think just that there's, regardless of what you think of it personally, he was just saying there's nothing in the human world, in the mortal earth that we have here, that is as powerful and all-encompassing as something like religion. He kind of saying like, there's nothing, if you're trying to merge with something larger and you're trying to do it on Earth, it's not going to work because everything on Earth is mortal and dies. Even another, like if you invest in another human being or like he's kind of saying it's only really like ideologies and these larger things that can satisfy that existential need we have to merge with something more important than ourselves. It has to be larger than this world. And I think that's kind of part of why he would use like Kierkegaard a lot, because that's all of like the Knights of Faith and all of that. So hopefully that answers it a little bit.
Oh, no, that was brilliant. That particular point, I want to come back to that contrast with Freud, because I have another question that directly relates to that, because it's kind of, I'll come back to that one, because I want to stick to this to an ontological motive a second, because it specifically relates to Western culture, where just kind of a thought I had, and I don't know if it really maps onto the concepts directly, but it's that so much of since the mid 1800s, and with Darwin doing his thing, and then Nietzsche saying, you know, announcing God to be dead in the late 1800s, and the growing secularization in the Western world, and is that this all stemmed from this scientific revolution, enlightenment, and then essentially that was this. I think of it like the Enlightenment sword having two edges, a double-edged sword, where one edge kind of cut away these shackles that were chaining down human reason and freedom and human individuality and ability to do our own thing. But at the same time, it also cut out this God-shaped hole in Western civilization. And it created this meaning vacuum, and it precisely to this perspective. And I think of it like, just like in physical space, physical vacuums seek to fill themselves, in metaphysical vacuums also seek to fill themselves. And we're in this situation, and I can't think of it, but there's this eros and agape that he talks about in the twin ontological motive, that the Freudian, that he used Freud as the kind of archetype for the kind of the eros and this unwillingness to merge, and then Kierkegaard as the willingness to make that leap of faith and merge. But that in Western civilization, that there's this hyper, as a kind of obviously this is just like a general sweep, but when you look at things like suicide rates, even in very, very wealthy countries, that there's this the meaning vacuum, just it seems like there's this continually fragmentary, hyper individualistic focus on just that kind of eros side, this desire to individuate and separate and be special and stand out in all this. But there's this inability to make that leap, and what to merge toward. So like Becker, even at the end of The Denial of Death, I have a really nice quote here, where he says, who knows what form the forward momentum of life will take in the time ahead, or what use it will make of our anguished searching. The most that any of us can seem to do is to fashion something, an object or ourselves, and drop it into the confusion, make an offering of it, so to speak, to the life force. So that is an awesome quote, and I absolutely love it, and I get kind of pumped even reading it. But so I suppose that whatever Becker meant there by life force was whatever he was seeking to merge, to make that leap of faith towards worth contributing toward. So there's a lot of questions spring from my kind of build up there. But first of all, do you have any kind of insights on what Becker meant by the life force, and also do you have any thoughts on the kind of meaning crisis, meaning vacuum in the Western world, and what role Becker's work and our terror management theories findings might play in helping to kind of help people along and kind of address this God-shaped hole?
Deborah, do you want to start with the life force?
Nope. You could take life force. I could take a little bit about meaning vacuum.
Well, I think the life force thing is open to your own interpretation. Because he died, we don't really know what he was leaning towards, although we know he wasn't a-religious, and he definitely became probably a little bit more. And again, when I say religious, I think I mean more like spiritual, in the sense of he wasn't associating it with a particular institution. But I think for him, it was um, just acknowledging these like larger possibilities in life. He talked about that a little bit with the experience of having children, just that being kind of a mystical experience in itself. And so I think but I think with the life force, I think my interpretation was a little more secular. It was like, the most we can do is, well, secular in the sense that but everything is connected, and like the most we can do is like, we're a living creature, and we can contribute and add something to the life force, being like everything that's alive, whatever, like all matter is neither created nor destroyed, right? So you're just adding yours in and hoping it makes a positive splash versus a negative one. Yeah. So in terms of the like his thoughts on what to do about this like lack of meaning and people seeking it in the wrong ways and all of that, I don't actually think our society was necessarily better when religion was the dominant model, because the problem with religion is that you still need faith. There's nothing perfect that's going to buffer you from existential anxiety absolutely perfectly. Even the most religious person ever has not been on the other side. So it's never perfect. And even if maybe, sure, like that religion does give a little bit more of that sense of something bigger, because it literally is talking about that, versus more, who knows, more secular values. I think if anything, it's not a safeguard, because people can still become very, very defensive and threatened when people challenge their religion. So even if it's the most dominant thing, it's not always a good thing. I mean, look at the Crusades, right? Lots of people die just because of fighting about what's the one version of truth. And so I think that, or in general, just religious warfare has led to many people dying, because it's not a perfect system. And as long as unless the whole world has the same view, it's never going to be perfect. So I think in terms of how TMT and Becker's ideas can help us with this, is that it gives you, if you think about it and if you're open to it, to challenging your own worldviews, is that it gives you the choice. And that's not just Becker, that's every existential philosopher. That's what existentialism is. It's like life doesn't have meaning or a meaning, but you get to create whatever meaning you want. It's pretty arbitrary, but you can still make it meaningful for you. And so it's kind of, yeah, like if what your worldview, if it's not like hurting anyone else, then you should find value in that. I'll let Deborah continue if she has anything to add, but those are my thoughts.
Well, one thing I want to mention is that, and this pertains to both of your last two questions, is that another great guest for you all to have on would be a guy named Greg Bennick, who is currently writing a biography of Becker on behalf of the Ernest Becker Foundation. So I think he could have first of all, he's a very dynamic, intelligent person who knows this work well, but could be interesting to fill in some gaps about Becker's life and Becker's experience. He's been researching for several years, and he's shifted to writing now, so we still have a ways to go. But one thing I think would be helpful for sort of your listeners who maybe haven't had exposure to this work before is to talk a little bit about how Becker thinks about how we get meaning into our life. And unfortunately, there's a couple terms in this world that Lyla and I live in that are kind of condescending. One of them is from Becker, and it's Immortality Project. Each of us has a little project to make sure that we're going to have meaning and continue beyond our deaths. And those look like all kinds of things. So having a child, writing a book, being a war hero, being a terrorist, being a parent, having a statue of yourself, anything that seems like it can, transcend your own time. By the way, I think terror management itself is another example of kind of a condescending, title we have on things, but we sort of inherited those and can't go back and change them. But thinking about instilling meaning in our lives, we look to culture. So one way I've had meaning in my life is being good at work. And so culture tells me, first of all, I graduate from college, I'm on my way, I do this or that, and I'm marking off these things that culture says, you're doing good, Deborah. And so we all need those things. And like Lyla said, it could take any form. I think one of the things about awareness of death anxiety is to figure out, are you going to use pro-social coping mechanisms or anti-social coping mechanisms? And that's, comes down a lot to, and some of those it'll depend on your level of awareness. It'll depend on your level of feeling of belonging. And it'll depend on how threatened you are. It'll depend on your probably underlying economic and social conditions. I think about
who's
Israel
threatening you?
Pardon?
Who, like, also not just like how threatened you are, but like who is the threat, and that
Right.
determines how salient the other things are.
Right. So
Who or what?
just to give some of your listeners like a couple quick examples of how these TMT studies bear out. So the first and probably most well-known TMT study took a group of judges in Arizona, where Jeff Greenberg is based, and they they divided the judges into two groups. The control group got a personality questionnaire, and the other group getting mortality reminders, their personality questionnaire was the same, except it also asked the question, what do you think will happen to you after you die? Then they presented with these judges with a pretend case of a prostitute arrested for prostitution and asked them to sentence that person to a fine. This was part of these judges' day-to-day work, so it was very normal for them. So the control group that was not reminded of their mortality sentenced an average $50 fine, and the group that was asked about their mortality in the personality test sentenced an average $455 per fine. So, what is that saying to us? Well, one, this took place in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, I think, and that was very much a tough on crime era here in the United States. And when you are reminded of your mortality, you want to affirm your cultural worldviews. That is what you're trying to do. So for each of us, that looks different, right? And it depends on the circumstance. Another study that I think was in Germany that I thought was really interesting for its subtlety is they did person on the street interviews, and they had a control group just on the street, and they were asking them about immigrant issues and immigrant rights. And then the group that was mortality interviewed, they were simply interviewed standing in front of a funeral home. So as they were being interviewed, there was a funeral home, over the shoulder of the interview. The mortality reminded group gave much more anti-immigrant responses than the control group that wasn't reminded. So like in the work I do with police accountability, imagine you're working in a profession where they're hyper-vigilant, where they like to hype being, under threat. It's very much part of their cultural bond and everything. So you can see the danger right there before you when people are responding, and we also know they're, more racist when they're reminded of their mortality. All those things come into play. So it has really a big impact on American life and with the whole world, obviously, the whole world community. And, one of our big goals is to help spread this information. So we're offering this, and I put this out to your listeners too. We're offering seminars on Ernest Becker and TMT 101. And then we're also offering tailored workshops for people working on like social justice issues. Like coming from my world, I know people who work on the death penalty and abortion rights and all those issues that are inherently death reminders. The minute I start talking to you about the death penalty, you're thinking about death. How am I supposed to persuade you in whatever direction I want when you're, dealing with that reality? So our new initiative is to kind of start educating people in the cause-based advocacy realm about not just like to teach them the lens of death anxiety, but also more importantly, to give them tools to try to overcome some of the defensiveness in their communications. And it won't surprise you that those tools that come from TMT are similar to communications advice that comes from other sectors as well, lifting up shared values, just different techniques of of how you introduce people to information that can help you be more successful in overcoming their biological reactions. So I know I didn't answer your question, but I feel like I did okay.
No, it was good. I actually have a follow on to that precisely because there's this. So just I may be incorrect here, but to any of the listeners, there's a massive difference between who aren't familiar with the scientific research process and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned there 2 different studies on TMT, but that's 2 out of about 1,000, if I remember correctly. And out of that, like by the time The Worm at the Core was published, it was more than 500. And then that would have been, I don't know, finished writing 2014-ish, published in 2015. There's more than 1,000 studies from all over the world, cross-culturally, all different religions, races, nationality, all this. So it's really, especially as something as messy as research psychology, it's unbelievably well replicated research. Like as far as any branch of research psychology that I'm aware of, it's so well replicated across so many different domains, which is what's absolutely fascinating. And so this I suppose if the first question is, would you have any thoughts on, so given the fact that Becker's excellent, beautifully written book, like it's not just a philosophical presentation that's kind of dry. It's like I can read another section of it in a bit that I plan to read it, but it's so well put together. And like, I'll actually read this. There's a section of it actually, because like I mentioned Nietzsche earlier on, and there's this thing that Nietzsche said about himself, where he said that he philosophized with a hammer. And I think that Becker, some sections, he kind of did the same. And this is towards the end of Denial of Death again. He says, "What are we to make of a creation in which the routine activity is for organisms to be tearing others apart with teeth of all types, biting, grinding flesh, plant stalks, bones between molars, pushing the pulp greedily down the gullet with delight, incorporating its essence into one's own organization, and then excreting with foul stench and gases the residue, everyone reaching out to incorporate others who are edible to him, the mosquitoes bloating themselves on blood, the maggots, the killer bees attacking with a fury and demonism, sharks continuing to tear and swallow while their own innards are being torn out, not to mention the daily dismemberment and slaughter in natural accidents of all types. An earthquake buries alive 70,000 bodies in Peru. Automobiles make a pyramid heap of over 50,000 a year in the US alone. A tidal wave washes over 250,000 in the Indian Ocean. Creation is a nightmare spectacular taking place on a planet that has been soaked for hundreds of millions of years in the blood of all its creatures. The soberest conclusion that we could make about what has actually been taking place on the planet for about 3 billion years is that it is being turned into a vast pit of fertilizer. But the sun distracts our attention, always baking the blood dry, making things grow over it, and with its warmth giving the hope that comes with the organism's comfort and expansiveness." So that's philosophy with a sledgehammer, if I've ever read it. Like that's like, so like there's so much of the book is written in this stunning fashion, beautiful prose, presenting ideas like that simultaneously shocking and wonderful at the same time because of the impact and the poeticism of it. But then so you have this masterpiece of a book that won a Pulitzer Prize, and then you have a field of research psychology that's been replicated, that has produced studies, over 1,000 studies across the world. What are the obstacles to these ideas? What do you think the obstacles are to these ideas making it into the zeitgeist? Because it seems like it's just so, it seems to me so bizarre. Like when I came across Becker, I came across Sheldon Solomon initially, and then led me to Worm at the Core, and then I read Becker afterwards. It just seems like this almost feels too good to be true. Like it's a unified theory of psychology in a certain respect, especially when you have such a massive body of scientific research backing up these philosophical ideas. So I'm just blown away that these ideas are not more widely prevalent in Western secular culture, considering the meaning crisis and vacuum. Is it that death denial is just baked into the God-shaped hole issue, and that that's just, let's not talk about it. Like, what do you think the obstacles are? Because I'm perplexed, to be honest.
Yeah, we've always said, that Becker deserves to be a household name more than Freud, since more of his stuff has borne out to be true, as you pointed out. I mean, I'll be interested to see what Lyla thinks, but for me, I think the topic is in itself something that people avoid. You're probably aware that there's a so-called death positive movement, and it has kind of three different threads to it. One is where I would put us, which is sort of the intellectual issue. We're less interested in death itself, but the impact that death has on our lives. Another thread of it is green burial and end of life caregiving and like all the, shifting. And then the third part would sort of be morbidly curious people. And so that's emerged like in the last 10 years. There's a mortician who has a YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician, who's a big Becker fan. And she was one of the founders, of the two founders of the death positive movement. Her name's Caitlin Doty. But I mean, I do feel like there's a heck of a lot more healthy dialogue going around related to both the intellectual end of things as well as the end of life challenges and sort of the good death and the acceptance of death. I think death acceptance would probably be a better term than death positivity, because nobody can really feel very good about it when you've actually gone through losing someone and that kind of thing. But one of the things that really inspired me, our founder died a little over a year ago, Dr. Neil Elgee, who founded the Ernest Becker Foundation after he retired as a physician in 1993. And both Lyla and I, especially Lyla, spent time with him as he was dying, and we'd go visit. And I remember when I was there and someone asked him kind of, well, how's it going, Neil? And he said with a smile, I don't know, I've never done this before. And just that sort of like openness to the experience really struck me. Like, I've never done this before and I'm never going to do it again, but I'm just present, right? And I think that stuff could really help us all be healthier. I'm in the sandwich generation, even though I'm an open-faced sandwich. All my friends are dealing with parent issues, and I'm seeing so much death denial in the different ways, whether they think it's okay to put someone in a home or not okay. And the parents who were in such denial that they, neglected to do important things that are troubling their children now. So it is such a strong impact on so many parts of our life. So that's why we have this public education initiative that I sort of described. And if anyone wants to reach out about that, it's info@ernestbecker.org. But there's a place, last thing I'll say before I pass to Lyla, there's a place in Maui called the Death Store. It is a very cool place that has, first of all, they have green burials and burials at sea. But beyond that, they serve as a community center for people thinking about and coping with death. And they have a death library as well. And the guy who set it up, he says, all he gets is feedback. Don't call it the Death Store. Don't give it that name. Nobody will come. But he's determined to do it. Does it hurt his desire to, bring more people in? I don't know, but I definitely respect, think about these terms. I saw recently story about someone who committed suicide, a young person who committed suicide, and it said in the newspaper article that they passed away. It's like, he shot himself in the head. It's, it's just the cover up of death does it a disservice with language and other things as well. So that was a long, extended, digressing answer, but let's see if Lyla can throw something more in.
Good.
The only thing I would say, no, I actually don't have anything to add except the same answer of, I think your answer is in the title of the book, Ciaran, The Denial of Death.
Yeah, and this is what I thought. So I kind of called it, so given the findings from terror management theory, I've kind of tried to give it a shape, and I just called it in my notes, DOD impact paradox, a denial of death impact paradox, which basically I'm trying to give a shape to it. This idea that because when one of the realities to death denial is to throw up the defenses that causes you to dig in your heels on your own cultural worldview and desire to seek self-esteem, then it's like, how do we talk about death denial without getting people to throw up the defenses? It's almost like you need to come at it from a place of, okay, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you something in a minute, but what I'm going to tell you might get you to try and dig in your heels in your cultural worldview. Just pay attention to that, because what I'm saying might ask you to do that, or might entice you to do that. So it's like it's almost like baked into the ideas are the fact that it's going to get people to throw up the defenses and in front of it in the first place, and then make it harder to cast seeds and to actually get any fruit back, because that's the best I could kind of come up with, because the body of knowledge behind it is massive, and then the book itself is brilliant, but as you said, it is growing. Like myself and Ian both would have had quite a exposure to the Roman Stoics over the years, and they've obviously a massive component of Stoicism is death meditation, and this is like becoming, especially in the kind of it's kind of like this operating system that's filling for a lot of people the kind of God-shaped hole, the kind of like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, and I know Ian's reading Epictetus at the moment. But so do you have anything to add to that, Ian?
Yeah, I was going to just jump in there on a couple of things, because as a person who is new to Becker, I find this conversation fascinating. So I'm sitting back here getting this front row audience. It's awesome. But also as well, I find Becker to be a little bit like Nietzsche. And that's why I find it hard to read. And not that it's hard to read in terms of the wording, but I can read a paragraph or a line, and then I can sit there looking at the wall for an hour. And I'm like, whoa, because you start thinking about it on these multi-levels. But I think it's interesting when I start, because we all, again, you talk about meaning in life, you look for that, the relevance of the book or the prose, Ciaran, that you say are so well written, and you start kind of thinking about examples in your life or how you deal with other people. And it's interesting, Deborah, because in a conversation with somebody the other day that got quite heated, I started getting kind of annoyed with one person in a group, and I was like, this is interesting. I started kind of sitting back behind myself. Why am I getting so mad with this person for no reason, because they disagree with me? And I was like, I was kind of watching myself in action, and it was really nice. And to kind of just have that awareness to shut my mouth and look at myself and observe my feelings. I was actually getting hot. I was getting a bit sweaty. I was getting a bit angry. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Like, I'm watching my physiological responses here for no reason on this automated path. But so that's interesting in one respect. The other thing, Ciaran, which you just alluded to there about this, and as Lyla said, the denial of death, I find this fascinating, because I found culturally, and everybody obviously grows up differently. If we spoke about death in our house, stop talking about dying. Why are you so morbid? Don't talk about this. Don't talk about that. I also find it interesting culturally that we will celebrate births of kids all over Facebook, gender reveals, baby showers, christenings, everything's about the baby. Someone dies, it's like, shut your mouth, say nothing. Like Deborah said, they passed away, shh, don't talk about that, be respectful, stay away. And I noticed here in Australia, you very rarely see a funeral procession. So in Ireland growing up, we used to see like what was called, so this person would die, sometimes be a wake at the house, and it'd be a 3-day affair. Then it would go to the removalist, and there'd be the removal from the body from the morgue to the church. And then the next day after that, we'll go from the church to the graveyard. It's kind of a 3-day affair. And that's kind of interesting. But it would go through town from the morgue to the church. And people would stop, traffic would slow down. Anybody walking would stop and kind of acknowledge. And you don't never see that here. It's nearly like it's buried away even more so here. And that comes obviously off the back of Catholicism. So I thought that was an interesting observation from different countries and how they treat that. Or if you look at India, it's like with the whole coronavirus, people are talking about the outbreak in India. And I said to people, yeah, I know what you're saying. I know we see pictures on the news and you're talking about bodies in the Ganges. But before COVID, people burnt bodies and put them in the Ganges. And some people were like, what? How come we never saw that before? I'm like, wait, no, it's not about a disease. That's a cultural thing that happens. So it's this kind of, people had no idea that happened. I said, death in India around Hinduism is quite different. We spoke about sky burials in Tibet where they put the body on the mountain and the birds would eat it. And people were like, oh, that is disgraceful. That is so disrespectful.
And so it's really interesting when you start getting into different cultures about death, how people approach it, that how you said, Ciaran, it's like the shutters come down straight away. I don't want to talk about the denial of death, you know. And so when you start opening up and talking about it, it's actually quite fascinating. I think even personally, regardless of talking to other people, you start going through all these barriers you have. We spoke about religion. I feel like that might be a barrier because you're trying to create meaning. People have kids. So I don't have kids and I'm in my mid-40s. And people always say to me, what are you going to do when you're old? I'm like, what do you mean? Oh, who's going to look after you? Look after myself. Yeah, but if you don't have kids, no, I go, well, I know a person that's in their 80s and there are 2 kids that they have. One lives in the UK and one lives in America. They're not coming home every evening to look after them. So if you're having kids to look after you, isn't that more selfish than not having kids? Yeah, but that's just one example. I'm like, I know loads of examples like that. So why would you have kids to look after yourself in the future? It seems to me bizarre. If you want someone to look after yourself, why don't you save some money for a carer later on who will actually do the job you're asking them to do, because your kids will resent you. And so I find this really interesting how everything, a bit like Freud, he put everything back to sex. I think once you start reading Becker, you start going, this is why I do this. I laughed earlier on because Deborah said about writing a book. That's one of the things I want to do before I die. I said last week. I just kind of, it's really fascinating as I get into this more and more. You start actually through this process, regardless of the death, you start understanding more about yourself. And that's where I'm in. I'm in this very novice beginner stage of the Becker work compared to Ciaran, who's obviously very well read and has thought about it a lot. So for me as a novice, I find this fascinating because I'm kind of smiling every 2 sentences here because I'm seeing myself in the conversation and in the work. So it's probably the cheapest way you can undergo therapy, I think, by reading Becker's book.
Nice.
I want to thank so much for those comments. I want to lift up and Ciaran's praise for the writing. You both, Ian, you said how hard it is to slog through, and Ciaran, you said how beautiful and succinct and hard-hitting it is, and they're both true, which makes it so challenging. So the 2 books that we recommend as entry points for folks are The Birth and Death of Meaning and The Denial of Death. But also, if you're not in the mood for a read and you kind of want to learn about terror management theory, there's a good documentary called Flight from Death that you should check out, that all the Ernest Becker Foundation superstars except me and Lyla are in it. There's also a few good like YouTubes on TMT and other things that can be helpful. One other thing I wanted to mention about the language is we haven't really talked about how one aspect of seeking meaning is to distinguish ourselves from animals. We know animals definitely live and die, and they do all kinds of other gross stuff in between. And, you know, they don't really have meaning. Nobody even knows their names, right? But we have meaning. So how do we sort of separate ourselves? And that's what a lot of our cultural markers call for us to do. But I think one quote from Becker that really captures sort of the complexity of the human condition is that we're gods with anuses, right? We have this amazing intelligence. We're able to envision and create, you know, space flight and all the other incredible things we do, yet we still poop and pee and do all these carnal things that remind us that we are like animals. And it's really a struggle for us to like distinguish ourselves. I don't know for sure. I think a better route is probably just to, you know, take peace in being like as part of nature, but part of the hole in our society of meaning is just for that to not be okay. You know, we need to separate ourselves, and Becker calls it things that are creaturely are things that make us react. So for women, that, you know, we have a great actual feature on our website about feminism and Becker. But, you know, there's been studies that show that when reminded of mortality, people will, you know, move away from a woman who drops a tampon out of her purse. There's all childbirth, breastfeeding, all those things are mortality reminders. So if you thought it sucked to be a woman before, now it really does.
Yeah, you see that in the Worm at the Core, they have big sections on it where they go through they talk about tattoos and haircuts and jewelry and all these attempts, and elaborate clothing as these attempts to distance from animality. And that study in there where they had the tampons and death reminders, and there was some kind of an interview, if I remember correctly. It was one of the particular studies involved some kind of an interview process or some kind of a rating process, but it was fascinating, these reminders. I actually, off the top of my head, there was an author, a co-author, Diane Rogers is her name. She co-authored this book called The Sacred Cow, basically around sustainable regenerative agriculture and cattle farming, and looking at the different, from all different angles. And in an interview I saw with her recently, because I'm living in the countryside and I'm just fascinated. I'm not a farmer, but I'm fascinated with soil in particular and climate and everything. So it's a slight tangent, but one of the things that Diane Rogers mentioned, which I don't know if there's any terror management theory studies on this, you might know, is that she just kind of, I don't know if it was kind of like a spur of the moment thing she said, but she talked about this, not that everyone, but that the massive take up on veganism in the Western world could be along these lines of this denial of death, this separation from flesh, separation from meat, separation from the animals being killed, because they're just inherently death reminders to have a piece of meat on a plate, especially if it's raw and there's blood involved or there's some heme on the plate. So she kind of mentioned that because she herself is a sustainable regenerative farmer, and she works with, as a dietitian and practicing clinical nutritionist, she works with particularly specializes in working with vegans who happen to have just not use appropriate supplementation, or whatever way they went about the vegan diet that they ended up damaging their health. But do you know, before I move on, do you know of any studies or research on vegetarian or veganism and TMT? Was there any done? I never looked any up. Do you know of any?
That would be for Lyla, but I will mention, because I'm going to digress too, that there is a woman, a very cool woman here in Washington State named Katrina Spade, who the Ernest Becker Foundation met through our work, and she has invented a new way of dealing with bodies after death. It's called Recompose, and she makes them into soil. She developed the system with Washington State University, which is in Eastern Washington. She lobbied the Washington State Legislature to get it approved, and now I believe that she's in her first or second year, and they've already processed several dozen at least bodies, and she's passing laws in other states. So since you're a soil fan, guess what? You can become soil too. Lyla, did you know of any studies that relate to veganism or vegetarianism or anything?
So I would say it's more about like animals, and but like not I guess in terms of what we eat that I know. I know that there's a lot of research showing that like death reminders result in distancing from the physical body. So like, for example, there was a study that showed death reminders increased the desire for romantic but not physical aspects of sex, because the physical aspects remind us too much of like our animality. For another like example, yeah, like Deborah mentioned the tampon thing, and like another study showed that if you prime people to think about the similarities between humans and other animals, so like equating us more with animals, they will react more negatively to pregnant women. Like things like that. And like people prefer they always prefer things that frame us as distinct from other animals rather than having many things in common. I will say there was a study that showed people rating like body and animal products as like more disgusting after a death reminder. So maybe that could kind of relate to like meat eating, although I could also see it going the other way, where it's like, one of the ways that we reduce our death anxiety is by having control over the environment and animals in nature. So like maybe eating them, and like that could maybe help with the feeling superior and like feeling like we dominate nature. You're not a threat to us. Like we are the master, like we're not gonna be taken by these animals and these. And I mean, that does bear out with the research on like, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Sustainability. So like there are some studies that show that after death reminders, people tend to, one study had people like in this hypothetical resource management game, and people were consuming more resources after the death reminders. And again, I think it relates to like wanting to feel dominant over nature. And another thing, another study showed that people perceive nature as less beautiful after death reminders. But that's again, keep in mind that this always relates back to like who the participants are. I think if you have a group of environmental activists, those type of studies will not work, or rather they'll have the opposite effect, because for them, their whole worldview is about, like, they're getting their meaning from protecting the environment. So chances are you remind them of death, they're going to go even harder on the environmental protection. But the average person who maybe that's not a major value for them, who is maybe just more threatened by animals and nature, might actually go the other way. So it's something to keep in mind with like environmental advocacy, is that it really matters who the audience is before you start targeting the message, because you could actually have it backfire by using too many fear tactics and death reminders if it's with the wrong group of people. So.
No, that's absolutely spot on.
Oh.
Share something. Sorry about that. I'm going to share something with you guys that relates to our conversation. Sorry, it's not right available, but this is about having children. Someone mentioned thinking about having children in this context. Here is a cartoon. And for your listeners, it has a little baby. He's about to say his first words. Here come his first words. Your selfish desire for symbolic immortality brought me here to suffer as an ornament to be owned and displayed. So that's
excellent.
Yeah, that one speaks to a lot of us, I think.
So
yeah.
good.
Deborah, if you could please email me that little picture, that would be awesome. We could put that in the show notes where people could download and share. We can also put it on our Instagram page as well. Yeah, I like that. That's quite.
I thought you might, Ian.
But on the same hand too, that makes people very irate sometimes, and then people scream at me, "You wouldn't understand," and walk away. I'm like, yeah, I don't. So that's why I made a joke, like, you know. So it's quite fascinating.
One thing, Ciaran, when you were talking earlier about sort of how to engage people on this topic, I know during this conversation I used the term death denial, but Lyla and I agree that using the term death anxiety is really better. And the denial of death was actually not Becker's idea for the title. It was a brilliant publisher, and I think it served them very well. But when we try to talk to folks and use that term denial of death, it doesn't fit for them, and understandably so, because I'm not denying death, you know, because it's not understood as a subconscious or unconscious thing that's very biological within us, and it feels more like a decision to avoid a topic you don't like. And so we just, even though I mistakenly used denial or death denial in our conversation, I think death anxiety hits a little bit better. And one of the things we just want to learn more and more about, and this might interest you, Ciaran, is because I think it speaks to what you were trying to do, is we're offering like I mentioned this, the EBS Terror Management 101, that helps people from a personal perspective kind of work through what does this information mean to me in my life. And then, you know, you could go deeper later on that. But just FYI, if you ever want to participate, we'd love to have you or any of your listeners.
Oh, that sounds brilliant. Like I'd be like preaching to the choir kind of a scenario for me. Like even here in my arm, one of my tattoos, Memento Mori, has been written on me for years. So remember, you must die. It's been I've been deep on the Stoicism for, I don't know, and Japanese Zen practices, I suppose, and death meditation since about 2014. So I'm a bit of a nerd for this stuff. So that kind of thing strike my fancy.
You must be popular at the pub.
Can I ask a question that maybe is addressed later on in Ernest Becker's work, but I'm not too sure. And this is something that I've kind of played around with some alternative theories around sleep. So obviously my research area is in sleep and performance, a lot with athletes and industry and stuff like that. And one of the things I often wonder about is, because we still don't know, is what is the purpose of sleep? And so some like what is the true purpose? Some cultures talk about being a practice for death. If we look at in yoga, we do shavasana, which is like the corpse pose, which people often find very hard to just sit still and do that. Some people say it's actually the hardest pose in yoga, to lie flat on your back and not move. So I was just wondering, is there any crossover about not the purpose of sleep, but in terms of sleep being the practice of relaxing for dying? Because we do go into this unconscious state where we may never wake up again, but we do it every single night. And it's sort of, we kind of do it, without question. And do you think maybe there could be some relationship with sleep being the practice for slipping into this eternal death and unconscious state where we just disappear? Or is there any sort of linkage with that area? I'm looking for that multidisciplinary approach to follow on Becker's approach.
Like, could there be, or is there any research?
Both.
There is nothing to my knowledge, and
we have a new project.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I've actually. Oh wait, there is something. Okay,
go ahead.
There was a study that showed. Hold on, something about like bedtime procrastination being related to death anxiety. And I've always actually sort of felt, I hate going to sleep because I'd rather be awake. I hate that we need sleep. Like, I just want those hours. Like, I don't enjoy it at all. I know a lot of people like look forward to it, but I'm the type of person who's just like, dang, I wish we didn't have to sleep. It's a waste of time. Like, I want to just be alive and living my life. I feel like it is a little death, but it doesn't make me more at peace with death. It just annoys me. But anyway, let me see if I can find this procrastination study. Deborah, go ahead.
And while Lila's looking for that, what you ask makes me think about drawing a line to understand that. So Becker laid this all out for us, some of these hard truths, and TMT showed us that, yeah, he's really onto something. But what really doesn't exist is what people yearn for, is like solutions. Oh, okay, well, if this is the case, how do we counteract it? It doesn't work that way because everybody's different, everybody's cultural worldviews are different, and that kind of thing. So that's why this project, we actually used to call our project, we just properly named it, but we called it Lemonade. How do we make lemons out of, how do we make something tasty out of these lemons of human behavior and the human condition? So there is so much work to be done to do like what's on the positive side. Now, for me, I feel like TMT has been bona fide, proven, looks good. We know a lot. Now, what's the opposite side of that? For example, what kinds of practices could help us accept death better? What if when we lie down in Shavasana, we intentionally contemplate death and we understand it as a death practice? That might ruin Shavasana for a lot of people, but so sort of we're thinking about what would happen if you tested someone for TMT and then worked with them for like 6 weeks, once a week, talking about death related issues in a proper way, and then test them again. If we're able to find sort of positive impacts, how can they be, how can they be replicated, or so there's just, it's like a whole world. And, they call TMT the study of evil, unfortunately. And it does show evil, but it also can show heroism as well. And I think sort of we have to go forward to struggle with that and figure out how to better learn to scientifically prove that some of this stuff would actually help counteract that. We don't know for sure. We have our suspicions. There's some studies, but overall, I think there's a lot more work to do on like, how can we shift our reactions to be more positive and make it so that we can live with each other more easily.
Yeah.
Did you find it, Lyla?
Yeah, I did, and I guess Ian did too. But yeah, that's the one he put.
That's the one. Yeah, we'll put the link in the show notes for this. The title is "Life is Short, Stay Awake: Death, Anxiety, and Bedtime Procrastination," and it actually says terror management theory in the abstract. So we'll put the link in the show notes, and if we can get the full paper, we'll make that available as well.
Yeah, the effect was only significant for males, although I would say I would probably have it would work on me. But And they said that that's because men are usually in the research are more associated with risk-taking behavior as a way to manage death anxiety, and therefore that's related to, I guess, procrastination and sleep and whatever. But I feel this. I don't feel like I'm a risk taker, but I totally view sleep as like I delay it as long as I can. So anyway, yeah, that's the link, and cool.
And Ian, one other thing I wanted to mention is I've talked several times about police culture and police accountability. There's so many terrifying issues relating to police and sleep. And there's actually an expert here in the Pacific Northwest who's doing a lot in trying to educate police departments on how critical that is. And I can think of times in my prior job where if there was an officer involved shooting, I would get called at night and I would go observe the processing of the scene. And one night it was like 12:30. And by the way, I'm a morning person. So I woke out of sleep. I drove like half hour, 45 minutes to where I wanted to go. And then I parked my car and I promptly walked under the yellow caution tape and to where I thought I was supposed to be. You're not allowed to walk under the yellow caution tape. And I made a bunch of other mistakes that night. And as I was, beating myself up about it, a friend with who's a mental health professional said, when you are tired and woken out of sleep like that, you are not performing well, or maybe you are if you're exceptional, but most of us can't perform well. And it was just like first of all, I was super embarrassed. I did stuff I wasn't supposed to do, but it was like, okay, when this happens next time, I need to figure out how to get my head straight to do this really important job without making mistakes. And I think sleep is really powerful. And when you think about mixing lack of sleep with death anxiety in the case of police officers, it seems very dangerous.
Yeah, definitely.
I actually have a question about the police thing in a second, because it's a fascinating area, like the whole, especially since the George Floyd death last summer and the events afterwards, and then the Capitol storming at the beginning of January as well. And I wanted to touch on that, but one thing I'd love to ask about is in relation to the Freud and Becker thing again, because and this is kind of why it's kind of almost so too good to be true for me, because just like Freud had this claim that was like, I'm a big fan of Karl Popper, the philosopher who's kind of the father of the modern scientific method. And one of the things that tilted him toward this particular view of science, that a scientific claim was only one and that could be falsified, was his contrasting of Sigmund Freud with Albert Einstein. So he himself was around Vienna and these lads and some Adler and Freud, and he contrasted, because basically what happened with Freud was someone would come up with a new piece of information or a case study or something, and Freud would bend his theory to fit the new information rather than change his theory in response to the information, because he was always trying to bring it back to sex, and this Oedipal complex or the castration complex. Whereas every time, so basically it was that it didn't matter what evidence came about, he still bend the theory to fit it. But with Becker's work, there seems to be, is that a critique that you have come across on Becker's work, is that it's essentially a kind of an unfalsifiable claim? And that's obviously it would be a different story if Becker only wrote The Denial of Death and there wasn't 1,000 terror management theory studies supporting his claims. But I can imagine quite firstly, I suppose it's a two-part question. Firstly, is that a critique that you come across, and if so, how do you respond to it? I suppose the unfalsifiability of death being the worm at the core, to use the title of Solomon and colleagues' book. And secondly, what would be the strongest critique or critiques that ye have come across of Becker's work? And would you have any steelman for any of those critiques? Because basically, yeah. So they're the two-part questions. Have you come across that unfalsifiability question? And secondly, what are the strongest critiques you've come across of Becker's work or terror management theory writ large?
Deborah? Are you pointing at me?
I was pointing at you, but I'll just say real quick. I mean, there are plenty of people who have critiqued Becker's work and Becker himself over, since he came into being known. He, in addition to the other things we talked about with him in his career, he was a character, I think, and he, in addition to people being jealous and wanting to critique him, he just pissed them off. So he's been plenty critiqued. I can't say best or worst. We try when we talk about Becker to really encourage people not to see, we talk about Becker's work as a synthesis. It's not original. He's pulled from all these places that you've been talking about. So it's a synthesis versus a theory. And we just try to, be open about it to people. Now with TMT, there's definitely been some recent criticism of it that maybe Lyla can talk a little bit about it. And also the one other thing is I would say that Becker was a man of his time. So there are concepts within his writing that are considered offensive by today's standards for some. And, that's just part of the deal with the progression of the world. Lyla, what do you and Curly have?
So yeah, well, it's been a while since I've been in the research world, so I did at one point know this a lot more, but I mean, there's the issue of the evolutionary psychologists versus the social psychologists. The evolutionary psych, they have their own theories about systems and the human brain processing death anxiety and things like that. I mean, I don't necessarily think it's incompatible, and neither do the founders of TMT, but some of the evolutionary psychologists say that, even though, yeah, I think the resistance is more on the side of the evolutionary psych people, because I think the TMT people are more than willing to incorporate evolutionary psych. But yeah, so but in terms of the falsifiability, I would say I don't really know. I mean, I've heard that a lot too, it's not falsifiable, but I'm like, well, but they do study. I mean, in theory, the studies could have gone the other way. They could have shown that the death reminder condition had an equal, no difference from the control, but that's why you do research. And I think what they mean by unfalsifiable is more so you could always say, well, it's because of death. And in theory, no one could challenge you on it. If you're just going to say to someone, well, that anxiety is really death. Well, that anxiety is really whatever. But I'm but in the research, you can't really debate that. If they test the difference between a death reminder and other unpleasant negative things. And if death is coming out as a unique effect, it's kind of hard to acknowledge, or it's hard not to acknowledge that it must be a little bit unique. I mean, and then the other thing I would say is, at least from the researchers I know, they sort of poo-poo that in the sense of they just think it's kind of another denial method, which I guess the people saying that would be see, there you guys go again. But I think as a human being, it's just kind of common sense. I mean, personally, I guess to me, it's kind of a moot point, because why does it, I feel if you're living in a body and you understand that we are mortal, I guess, how is that not the thing that underlies everything else? And maybe you don't feel that way personally, but I just feel most of us living our lives at some point will go through that. And there's a lot of nuance with researchers in terms of well, is it really fear of death, or is it fear of lack of meaning? Is it fear of losing control? Maybe it's really this, maybe it's really that. And the response is always, you can't necessarily disentangle that. Fear, the reason we need meaning is because of death, because we know we create, they're completely mutually reinforcing. So to say, well, it's actually meaning. I mean, there's a theory called the meaning maintenance model, and they tend to kind of rebuff TMT a little bit of well, it's actually more the meaning thing, because that if you threaten meaning, it produces similar effects. It's well, yeah, of course, because the way people make meaning is to cope with, it's all connected. It doesn't mean that one is not valid. Of course, yes, meaning is a really important, we need that too. There was a recent replication crisis in the field of social psych. I don't know if any of you have kind of come across that, but that was another thing in TMT, was one of the fields that kind of got attacked of like, well, we tried all these studies and they didn't work when we did it in our lab, so it must not be as robust as you guys think. And again, the response from a lot of the researchers was that you guys replicated studies that we did in the 80s and 90s when the culture was totally different. And this is about social psychology. This is about how people interact, how they respond in groups, the zeitgeist of the time. Like, and you're repeating it and saying it doesn't work now after so many different political, social changes have happened. They're kind of like, well, no, duh. Like, we told you it probably wouldn't work. You have to test it based on the values that are salient to people right now, not from like 30 years ago. So, yeah, so I think it's all of it. I think that critique is necessary to science and it's great. But I also think that for me personally, even if TMT had never existed and the only thing I had read was Becker, it would totally make sense to me and still be something that was useful in my life. The one example I'll say, just to kind of the whole, well, death underlies everything, and it kind of seems like silly sometimes. I'll just take one example of like how this works, in how it can really, like, if you break it down, almost any fear. So let's say you have a fear of public speaking, right? That doesn't seem like it's about death. You're like, no, that's fear of public speaking. You're like, okay, but what is the fear, right? It's a social thing. So you're getting judged by peers. You could mess up, you could be embarrassed or whatever. Why does it matter to do well in front of a group of peers? Or why would being embarrassed be a negative thing? Because being accepted and being part of your peers and your social group is like evolutionarily adaptive, because in order to, as a social species, like, we need the approval of our group. Like, when you're ostracized, that's kind of akin to a death, because it's a lot less likely to survive when you're ostracized. And so being like something like public speaking or whatever, it's like, oh, it's fine. Like, you're not actually going to die if you make a complete fool of yourself, but it's going to kind of feel like that. And also, like, from your brain's perspective, it doesn't really know the difference. It's like, I need to be accepted because death can happen. And like, if you look at people who are ostracized in society for like alternative identities or whatever, like, they have higher mortality rates, because like the mental health and like the, just the depression that can come from being, and like, why do you think solitary confinement is a punishment? It can be fatal, and it works for that reason, because we do need that approval. So I just think that's an example I use to, when people are like, well, what do you mean death underlies every fear? And I'm just like, because if you dig deep enough, like, that is what fear is. It is like, that is, and even if something really on paper doesn't seem like it, your brain doesn't really know the difference. So I don't know if that
one other thing I just want to add on to Lila's talking about some of the studies is that they've also done studies where one group is reminded of their mortality and the other group is reminded of something really horrible that's not mortal, like terrible dental experience or something like that. And from my understanding, the studies still bear out that it's a death reminder that does the trick, not just other general horrible experiences. So I thought that was interesting as well.
That's really interesting what Lyla said, because it actually crosses over into another area, Ciaran, that we've spoken about, a reference, which is Sebastian Junger's work around tribes, which is, very much about if you're ostracized from those groups. So it's very interesting. We are coming towards the end of our time, and I know we could sit here and talk for 25 hours continuously. Ciaran could even break that record, I think, with questions about Becker. And I want to be respectful of your time. So maybe, Ciaran, was there any final question or a wrap up before we let Deborah and Lyla go? And I know it's late in the night for you as well, Ciaran.
Which is the final one? So I'll finish on a kind of a positive note, specifically. So just like I made a point of the kind of benefit that death contemplation, or the role that death contemplation has played in my own life, and the benefit that I've gotten from it, to the extent that I've gotten this death reminder on my arm. And I found this really nice quote here from an Irvin Yalom book, The Existential Psychotherapist. And he has his book Staring at the Sun. And there's a line in that where he says, so Marcus Aurelius would have said something like, you know, soon you'll be ashes or bones, and he used to write that in his journal. And then Michel de Montaigne has this essay, to philosophize is to learn how to die, and I think he's kind of referencing Socrates when he said that. And but Yalom, I really like this particular quote, is that he says, although the physicality of death destroys us, the idea of death saves us. So I absolutely love that for multiple reasons. And as a kind of a big picture view, the lens I'm kind of coming from is, what I'm particularly interested in is a large scale perspective, the survival of the species itself, of humanity, and the preservation of human potential at large. And like in a big picture evolutionary sense, our modern humans are about 300,000 years old. Like Homo sapien is about 300,000 years old. Our predecessor was about 2 million years, but the average years old, Homo erectus, but mammals typically live for about 1 million years. So we're only beginning, even if we're just an average. And that's not even if we look at the fact that we're these creators that can potentially colonize Mars and go off and even maybe remove enough mass from the sun so that it doesn't expand into a red giant and swallow the solar system or whatever. We can potentially do that stuff because it's not outside the laws of physics. But since 1945, we stepped into an era that Oxford philosopher Toby Ord has called the precipice, which is this, for the first time ever in human history, we developed a technological capacity to end the entire future of humanity without the commensurate love and wisdom to ensure we don't do it. So we're in this era now for the last 76 odd years where we have the capacity to end the whole show, derail the train. 300,000 years of Homo sapiens, 700,000 years less than a mammalian average. That's a pretty shit run, to be honest. And we have the capacity to do that. And I legitimately think that death anxiety and how we navigate death anxiety is going to be a key component in the survival of our species at large, given the fact that we're in this exponential tech environment where we're developing increasingly powerful weaponry and getting increasingly toxic information ecology that's influencing our sense-making capacity to be able to, because of social media algorithms and fragmentation, ideological polarization, all these things are taking place. So with all that big build-up, basically, what I'm curious about is, in an ideal world, if everything played out like ye would like to see it play out, what role do you see Becker's work and term management theory playing in our society and in our culture? Do you see it as something that could be part of education systems, curriculum, core curriculums, or something that you'd like to see artists producing art on more so that it gets more popular, exposure, music, movies, whatever? Like, how do you see this playing out in an ideal world? Because I'm legitimately concerned for the future of our species and think that death anxiety is going to be a determinant on whether or not we can keep the show on the road.
Wow, that's a big question. Deborah?
I mean, we're doing our darndest to get it out. There have been a number of educators that we've worked with over time who have taught it in high schools and other classroom settings. I think that the overall interest in end of life, even if they're not interested intellectually in death anxiety, we do attract people to the conversation because they're struggling with life and death issues. The reason, so I, on a personal level, I don't want to be depressing, but I don't really feel like life has meaning. I do think we're animals and we're going to come and we're going to go. But I realize that if we do not believe that we have meaning, then we do terrible things to each other and we treat each other poorly. So while I do this work, I do it towards a more peaceful human existence, both in terms of how we treat each other and how we treat the earth. And our latest newsletter was focused on these issues in climate change, which are just like huge, huge, huge issues. So I feel like it can be an incredible tool, or it may go ignored like a hell of a lot of other important information that's not popular in our current social climates. It's tough. it is tough, but
I also think sorry.
Last thing, the pandemic, I think, had a lot of connectivity and opened people's eyes, and it got a lot of play during the pandemic. So we have to look for those moments. If anyone out there wants to donate to the EBF, we operate on a shoestring. We get less than $30,000 a year in donations. Like we are living our own immortality project. We don't know if the organization will survive or not. So we are struggling with this too, because it's not, people who have money and can donate might feel like hungry people are a higher priority, and they might be right, so how do we sort of keep enough energy? So we've been looking for all kinds of partners to work on together and kind of people with similar interests. We're thrilled to be talking to you today and invite any of your listeners to be in touch through our website or info@ernestbecker.org. But to be quite honest, I think we have a challenge. What do you think, Lyla?
Yeah. The only thing I was going to say is, what was I going to I was going to say, like, it was reminded me of what you said earlier, that there's not like, that you can get to this lens through a lot of different ways, like meditation or other schools of thought, even just in terms of just examining your own biases, your worldviews, your defenses. Becker's just one way of, he's one guy who some people resonate with that, and he wrote about it, but he wasn't even the first one. He was taking ideas from a bunch of different people and trying to say, look, hey, this guy said this too, and look at this. And so, I mean, on that note, why I'm saying that is that I don't think that this one thing is going to save the world. I think it's just, in general, one of the things that is like hopefully helpful, hopefully a source of, I think generally what I would say is not just like this work, but just education in general. Like the more we're educated about history, the more we're educated about human behavior, different cultures, different, I guess, viewpoints, but also, and like critically examining things like intolerance, racism, prejudice. I think that's what would save us. I don't think there's any one. I don't think it's, like Becker's books need to be, if the whole world read Becker, we'd be fine, because it's still human nature. It's still free will. It's still all these things that people need to want to change, have to, so I think we're doing, like Deborah said, we're doing what we can, hope, because this is the lens we're taking. We're hoping to do our part in and drop our little offering into the life force and try to like have it be a positive. And because this is where we see our area of expertise, and like with certain people who we could help, we will. And then hopefully, I don't know, I guess my philosophy has always been, in theory, I mean, we totally could blow ourselves up, but like we haven't yet. And I think there's more people who want to live than don't, or who want the world to end and things like that. I mean, it might end for natural causes, but in terms of us causing it, I'm like, I try to live my life thinking there are more good people in the world than bad, because otherwise I don't think I'd be able to get out of bed in the morning.
There's a few books I'd probably ask you not to read, so for that optimistic.
Yeah, I like my positive outlook. I'm going to stick with it for now.
Yeah, like when I read about the Gulag Archipelago, I was like, I don't know if I can do this.
Oh my gosh.
As a slight clarification, the component of Becker's and terror management theory work in particular, I can't help but see it as akin to kind of Jungian shadow projection, like Deborah alluded to at the very beginning, and Ian did, that these things that annoy us about other people, that's like just like this kind of dehumanization that can take place as a result of death reminders, and I can't help but see it as akin to Jungian shadow projection, that where it's this unconscious process that's the source of anxiety, but we project it onto the other as the source of this anxiety, because it's something within ourselves that we're unwilling to confront, and it's like that. But then something that Jung said that I really like, and it relates to death anxiety, it relates to a whole load of threads relation to shadow projection and shadow integration, is this concept of like, what you most need to find is where you least want to look. And that it's, and this is the death anxiety thing, is that if it's something that makes us uncomfortable, then I think it's going to be in our interest and everyone's interest to at least have a look at it and not blink, because then we're less likely to make brash decisions that are going to work out badly. So
excellent. I think that's a nice point to leave it on. Thanks very much, Lyla and Deborah, for your time this morning, and thanks, Ciaran, for getting up in the middle of the night. Really appreciate it. We're going to end the recording in a second, so please hang on the line. But before we go, if people want to get in touch with the Ernest Becker Foundation, learn more, how can they do that? How can they get in contact with you guys? What can they do to learn more about this? Because we've only scratched the surface here.
Okay, I guess I'm doing it. All right, so yeah, you can reach out at info@ernestbecker.org is our email. We check that, and any outreach requests. We have our website, ernestbecker.org. It's Ernest, ERNEST. It is not Ernest like the word Ernest. So it's like the name. We have social media. We have a Twitter. It's just at Ernest Becker Foundation. And then we are on Facebook. We also have a discussion group on Facebook called the Death and Denial Discussion Group, where people can sort of exchange ideas and talk about Becker's work and whatever else, other existential topics that they'd like to. So those are the main ways. On our homepage, ernestbecker.org, if you just scroll down right in the middle, you can put your email to be on our mailing list for updates, events, webinars we might be having. We send about 1 email a month, so it is not one of those bombarding kind of things, but it's just if you do want those notifications about future goings on, that's the best way, is to be on that email list. And then you can get our quarterly newsletters as well, and other options. So I don't know if I left anything out, Deborah, but
nope, I think you're looking good there. Plenty out there. Our website is just a huge resource of everything we produce and have.
That's excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for having us so much.
Cheers.
And Ciaran, that bedtime procrastination is helping with your death anxiety.
I have at least 1 drink to get to sleep.
There you go.
Don't tell Ian though, it'll disrupt my circadian rhythm.
Get into bed. Get to bed, Ciaran, now.